By Govanid. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and we just had Valentine's Day 2021, and some of the other Tolkien YouTubers I know are doing Valentine's Day themed videos. And so in this video, what I wanted to do is talk about J.R.R. Tolkien as just kind of his general views on romance and the way he expresses that in his stories and that sort of thing. So I'm going to actually start with the way he portrays romance in his stories, and then I'm going to move into a letter that he wrote to one of his sons, Michael Tolkien, on the topic of relationships between men and women and how that might seem a bit strange given what we see from his stories. Make sure to check the description below for links to the other videos done by some of the other YouTubers on Valentine's Day related topics. So of course, the first thing we know about Tolkien's views on romance, if we're going in kind of chronological order of what he published, would be The Lord of the Rings and the love story between Aragorn and Arwen, and to a lesser degree, Sam and Rosie. Sam and Rosie get very little screen time as a couple, and Aragorn and Arwen do too, but at least Aragorn and Arwen get like an appendix section where their love story is really fleshed out a bit. And the way that their story goes is kind of similar to what you might expect from just any old romance kind of story. Aragorn meets Arwen for the first time and pretty much falls head over heels. You get the idea that Arwen takes a little bit longer to fall in love with him, which, given that she's been around for a few thousand years and is an elf and whatnot, maybe that's not so surprising. But the guy at least falls head over heels for the girl pretty much immediately, and Aragorn's story is more or less a quest for him to earn the right to marry Arwen, because Elrond basically sets him the task of, I'm not going to just let her marry anybody. You've got to be the king of Gondor and, restore the world of men to its former glory before I'm going to let you marry her. Otherwise, it's kind of all pointless. So there's definitely kind of a traditional romance type story there. And then the same story is very much echoed, which I really shouldn't use that word, because really Aragorn and Arwen echo this other story, and that's Beren and Luthien. Because Beren and Luthien is more or less the same thing, except in that story, Thingol, the father of Luthien, is much more of a jerk about having Beren complete a task, because he's intentionally trying to get Beren to complete a task that he thinks there's no way he could ever possibly complete, namely the recovery of one of the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown. And it is virtually impossible to complete. Beren and Luthien in the story, which is much more fleshed out than Aragorn and Arwen's story, do fall in love. Beren falls in love with her pretty much at first sight, and she at first is scared of him, not knowing who he is, but when they actually touch hands, she pretty much falls in love with him instantly. And they end up going on a lot of adventures together, he at first alone, because the Thingol wants him to go off and do this, but then she eventually escapes the watch of her father's guards and makes it to where he is, and they go through a lot of stuff to be together, and there's a lot more development in the Beren and Luthien story to that. Now, there's other relationships in Tolkien, most of which get very little development in that sense. Tuor and Idril, another man-elf pairing, get a little bit of time. They are the parents of Eärendil, and thus a very important part of the Silmarillion saga, but it's not a well-developed romance story. And you also have Turin, almost getting involved with Finduilas in Nargothrond, and then later getting involved with, unknowingly, his own sister. But none of these end up being real romance tales, so it's kind of hard to put them in the same boat. And the more interesting thing here is the fact that the Beren and Luthien story itself is based in some ways on Tolkien's own experience of falling in love with his wife Edith. And the part of the story where Beren first meets Luthien and sees her dancing among hemlocks is taken straight out of an event in Tolkien's own life where Edith was dancing among hemlocks in a forest. So you might get the idea from all of this that Tolkien is just kind of a very shallow, hopeless romantic, because he just kind of sees romance stories as these awesome, you fall in love at first sight and then you overcome all odds, love conquers all, and bam, everybody's happy at the end of the day. Of course, everybody's happy at the end of the day is not really how these stories end, and that's kind of an interesting segue into the letter, because in Beren and Luthien's story, of course, Beren ends up dying almost immediately after getting Thingol's permission to marry Luthien, and then she has to then die and go to the halls of Mondos and get his release, and then they're allowed to go back as mortals for a short time, and for a time they do have bliss, but after that they die relatively quickly, and we really don't know what their fate will be. Aragorn and Arwen have a happy marriage as far as we can tell, but they also have difficulty, because at the end, when Aragorn is on his deathbed, Arwen is really bitter over the fact that he's going to be parted from her, and it's, for elves, it's a hard thing because she's going to outlive him for quite a while possibly, and he tries to comfort her, and you don't get the idea that she takes a lot of comfort from it, so it's not perfect. And if you read Tolkien's biography, you can tell, while it doesn't seem that there were any really serious issues with his marriage with Edith, they didn't have a perfect marriage either. And part of that was, Tolkien had his male friends at the college, university, and he had his, all this energy he put into, developing the world of Middle-earth and all this other stuff. And so there were, strains on the marriage in that sense. And there's going to be strains on every marriage. But in this way, Tolkien recognized that marriage is never a simple, you fall in love at first sight with your soulmate and that's the end of the story. And so this is where I want to get into the letter that he wrote to Michael Tolkien. So this letter is written to Michael Tolkien, at least in large part, about advice on how to go about having relationships with members of the opposite sex. And it's not clear, but it seems like maybe Michael specifically asked him for this advice. But Tolkien kind of starts off by saying, and you have to remember, of course, that Tolkien was a very devout Catholic, so a lot of this is coming from a very Christian point of view. He starts off by saying, well, the first thing to remember is we live in a fallen world, and one of the aspects of that fall is the sex instinct is itself kind of broken in its context as it currently stands. And he points out, like, men are not really naturally monogamous as things are. They, men have a tendency to want to go beyond just having one partner, whereas women are much more naturally monogamous. And there's other issues that he brings up with regard to how, the fall affects how sexual relations go about. And he says, there's kind of three ways you could, well, maybe not three, but there's a few ways you could look at relationships with the opposite sex. And some people try to be just friends with the opposite sex. And he says that almost always fails. One of the two friends will almost inevitably fall in love with the other, and then it leads to problems. And he says, the old medieval idea of chivalry, while kind of helpful, is also not perfectly theocentric, meaning God-centered, because while chivalry does add a lot of value in the sense of, honor and being courteous and service to the other, specifically, male being in service to the female partner, it is based on an idea that tends to idealize the female partner, and in so doing, again, kind of takes the focus away from the theocentric and puts the woman on a pedestal, almost making her kind of a divine figure in the relationship. And this, Tolkien says, is really not good either, because women are, as he puts it, companions in shipwreck in the Christian worldview. It's like women are not less, fallen than men. They're not perfect things to be idealized and put on a pedestal. They have different issues. For example, he says they are less likely maybe to be unfaithful in a relationship, but they do have their own problems, and they're going to they're not going to be these perfect things that you can just kind of idealize in a romantic relationship. It kind of moves from this into a discussion of how men and women see romance differently, and I don't really want to get into that because that's not really the point. Plus, depending on your point of view, some of this a lot of people might disagree with in terms of what Tolkien is thinking. And Tolkien, in fairness, was a guy. He didn't have an inner look into the mind of a female. He was basing what he said on his experience, and his experience was largely based on Victorian and post-Victorian England, and that may not be the same as our experience today. So I'm going to leave that aside. I think he does have some valuable insights there, but take them with a grain of salt. But he moves on then to talk about the fact that men not being naturally monogamous, the women being more naturally monogamous, they tend to have, women that is, tend to have a more practical view of the relationship. And so they tend to be a little bit more interested in just setting up a home immediately, whereas men, to the extent that they kind of idealize the relationship, are not thinking in that way. And that's another danger of the whole chivalry type view of looking at it. And then he starts moving into, he also mentions in the chivalry context how it kind of treats love as like this outside thing that comes in and kind of takes over. And he kind of connects back with that a little bit later in the letter, talking about how in modern times we have this idea, in large part derived from literature, which is in large part the product of male minds at the time he was writing, that you meet somebody and you fall in love and they're your soulmate. And he talks about how this is dangerous because if you think of love in that way, you're going to inevitably, in any matrimonial relationship, the passion of romance is going to cool, and you're going to have some level of difficulties in the marriage. It's just not possible to avoid that in a fallen world. And as a result of that, a lot of people who have this kind of strange idea of what love is will end up thinking, well, did I miss my soulmate? And, they may meet somebody else that they think, well, if only I had met this person first, this would have been my real soulmate. And he says, if only leads to basically divorce. And the next thing you know, you've got people divorcing each other so that they can go after somebody else who they think is their real soulmate. And he said it usually is just the next sexually attractive person. And I think he's got a really good point here. It's like marriage, is not just a thing that you do because you found your soulmate. And your soulmate is not really that easy to pick. And in fact, he goes on to say, only a very wise man at the end of his life could look back over the whole thing and pick out among the number of women that he might have married the one that would have been the best choice. Basically, no matter who you pick, it's almost certain to be a mistake, in the sense that it isn't necessarily your best choice, given all the possibilities you had over your lifetime. And he kind of crowns this discussion by saying, of course, the true soulmate is the one you're married to. That's the one that you chose, to spend your life with, to, go through all of your trials and tribulations with. And, the point of marriage is that it, centers that desire for, the things that you want out of a male-female relationship on, a particular relationship, which he says is, even though males are not naturally monogamous, he says this is the best that you can get out of life, even though it's hard. And he even says too, like, it's hard even for men to remain monogamous, even with commitment. It takes willpower and it takes conscious effort. You can't remain, he says, completely 100% faithful to your spouse in both body and mind without some exercise of will. So, it's like, and here you probably have to think he had in mind the statement of Jesus in the Gospels, that a person who looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery. And so when he says that even in mind, he's like, even men who are physically faithful to their wives, mentally, unless they're really in control of themselves, are probably still to some level unfaithful. But I really love the comment, the true soulmate is the one you're married to. It's like this idea that there's this one person out there who's perfect for you is, it's really not a great way to look at the marriage relationship. He kind of ends this discussion by pointing out that, the idea of that idealized love at first sight with your true soulmate, that sort of thing might happen in real life occasionally, but probably very rarely. But it's still an idea that really takes hold of us because it's something that, you know, maybe in an unfallen world, that is kind of how it would work. He says, this might be a vision of what in a perfect world, the romantic relationship really would be like on a regular basis. But, such as things are, that's not how it works. And very rarely will you find two people, that are, kind of meant to be together, as it were. And he says, as it were, he doesn't think any two people are meant to be together. It's the idea that they're the most ideal match for each other. Very rarely will you ever actually see that happen. And he basically ends by saying, it's hard for me to counsel prudence because my own experience was very imprudent. And then he goes into like a historical, basically telling of how his relationship with Edith developed. And of course, if you know much about how his relationship with Edith developed, it was very imprudent. He almost lost a lot of his scholarship and whatnot in school because he spent so much time with her and less time focusing on his studies, to the point where his ward, Father Morgan, ended up basically saying, you can't see her again. So there was interesting issues there. He was living kind of the life of a romantic, even though now he's counseling his son, don't think of it that way. But anyway, at the end of the day, what you can see is Tolkien was not some hopeless romantic with doe eyes thinking that everything is just rainbows and sunshine. He had a pretty realistic view of how romance works. Agree or disagree with the specifics, he at least was willing to acknowledge romance is not quite as simple as we tend to make it in literature, which is probably why he does have some failed relationships in his stories. For example, Aldarion and Arendis, which I did a video on recently. I can link to that in the description below, because it's an example of two people in Numenor who really loved each other but had very divergent interests, and it eventually tore them apart. So that's an interesting counterpoint to all the, Beren and Luthien and Aragorn and Arwen and all that sort of things in his stories. So worth, using as a counterbalance. But that's pretty much Tolkien on romance, at least the major stuff. I mean, you could find other things that he said perhaps in other stories where there's a little bit more romance, but those are the major ones that I wanted to touch on. So, hope you had a good Valentine's Day, and I hope you found this discussion of Tolkien's views on romance interesting. I think a lot of things in Tolkien's letters are very interesting, and this is one of the more interesting ones in there. So, if you did enjoy it, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can find me on Twitter at JRRTLore if you want to get some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. If you want more Tolkien-related content, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon so you get all the notifications. You can also find me on Rumble now, and you can support me over at Patreon. Till the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.